The sun was already setting when the blacksmith began his walk from the village to his cabin in the woods. He carried a heavy sack with him as he made the almost mile-long trek through the fading light and the growing night. The blacksmith normally went home while the sun was a lot higher in the sky, but the nights were getting longer, and the blacksmith didn't want to leave his personal projects in his shop. So he made his way home at the late hour. He adjusted the sack on his back, and the rattle of chains could be heard in the sack as he made his way back home. The shadows grew longer as the blacksmith made his way through the familiar path home. Many of the villagers didn't go into the woods at night. It was too easy to get lost, fall into a deep hole, get eaten by some animals, or many other mundane dangers. Over the last few months, several villagers who went out at night disappeared, never to be seen again. But the villagers also feared a fae that supposedly haunted these woods at night. The fae was known as a Dullahan, or the Headless Horseman, a rider dressed in midnight black armor, riding a nightmare that crawled from the darkest depths of pandemonium. In one hand he wielded a mighty whip made from a human's spine, and in his other hand was a hatchet with the power to decapitate both trees and men alike. But the most prevalent trait of the Headless Horseman was his missing head. It wasn't that he didn't have his head. He still had his head, but he carried it in his arms, and the head, even severed, could still speak. And when it spoke a name, that person would soon die. Half of the village claimed to have seen the Dullahan that haunted the woods, and the other half was scared to deal with the woods out of the fear of the Fae. But luckily, Bob the blacksmith knew the truth. The most dangerous thing in these woods were wolves, and Bob carried a heavy iron hammer just in case he did run across any trouble. As the last slivers of light faded, Bob listened as the calls of the birds changed. It was a peaceful time, hearing the calls of birds change. During the day, some birds thrived, but as soon as night fell, those birds had to hide and be silent, fearing the predators that came out at night. In a way, it reminded Bob of his life in the village. During the day, everyone felt safe and felt that being loud was their right. But as soon as night started, even the biggest and strongest of them hid in their homes, while Bob was free to go home and do his work in peace. There was a fog settling in the woods. It normally wasn't foggy this far from Oceanus, but it looked like tonight was a rare exception. The fog already reached the blacksmith's legs, and he placed his iron hammer into his pack and removed his lantern. He lit it as he continued his way down the dark path. Here, in this part of the woods, the branches resembled bony fingers that tore at the blacksmith's coat. He kept his lantern up as the last of the sunlight faded, and the moon didn't have a chance to rise just yet. The only light was from the blacksmith's lantern as he traveled deeper into the woods. He entered Hasdrubal's hollow halfway to the cabin, and then Bob noticed something was wrong in the hollow. The woods here were completely silent. No birds, no bugs, no distant howls, no animal calls of any kind. There wasn't even the sound of the creek in front of him, nor the sound of the wind. There was something in these woods. Only a very large predator could make the hollow silent. So, removing his hammer from his sack, carrying it in one hand and his lantern in the other, the blacksmith carried on walking his path home. If there was a predator, staying put with his lantern would only draw it towards him. But if he didn't let it see fear, and he kept moving, then all would be well. He was certain of this. That was how wolves worked. Bob followed a curve in the path and stopped when he saw what was just beyond the curve. Sitting in the middle of the forest trail was the largest carriage he had ever seen. It could easily fit 20 people, and the wheels were as white as ivory, but the rest of the carriage was the darkest leather that the blacksmith had ever seen. It was clearly finely made. The four lanterns on the corners of the carriage were large and bright enough to belong back in the village, lighting up the streets. And those horses. Bob had once seen a Shire horse. It was large. Even the tallest man in the village came below that horse's shoulder. These horses were fine mares with fur as dark as the night sky, and a mane that was smoother than the finest silk. And they stood even taller than the Shire horse did. If the blacksmith was to guess, he barely came up to their knees, and they were almost all muscle beneath the black fur. Bob could tell the horse's eyes were full of quiet rage. They were like the deepest part of the ocean. Just because the horses weren't angry at the blacksmith didn't mean that they wouldn't get angry at him. But the oddest part of this was that the carriage had no coachman. Maybe they were lost in the woods, or they were busy with something else. Curious, the blacksmith approached the carriage with his hammer at the ready. He mounted the steps, and after climbing them, he was face to face with the door. Up close, he could see the details of the carriage he couldn't see earlier. It was leather, but it smelled different from any leather that he had seen before, and the texture felt different, but he wasn't sure what animal it had come from. And the edges of the dark window were not ivory like he thought. They were smooth looking, but rough to the touch and white. Whatever it was, it must have been expensive to belong to a carriage like this. Glass wasn't usually used on carriages either, let alone dark glass, meant to keep light out from the inside. The blacksmith grabbed the white handle and pulled on the door. It opened with a click, and the blacksmith's lantern flooded the dark interior of the coach. The inside was indeed luxurious. The seats were red and soft-looking, but cowering in the corner, Bob could see four young women with fresh sores around their necks, ankles, and wrists. Their hair was matted, dirty, and stank like it hadn't been washed in months. The women themselves were starved and pale, looking almost skeletal with their wide, fearful eyes. These women were very familiar to Bob the blacksmith. "What are you doing here?" Bob asked the missing women from the village, who only cowered from his words. Before Bob was able to say or do anything else, he felt a tap on his shoulder. The blacksmith slowly turned, his grip on both his lantern and his hammer tightening as he turned to face who tapped his shoulder. The blacksmith expected to come face to face with the coachman. What he instead came face to was a very large, broad chest in black leather coachman's uniform. The buttons were all polished to gleaming. The black leather was contrasted with red embroidery and a very high red collar. Looking down, the blacksmith could see that the coachman wasn't standing on the steps of the carriage. The coachman was still standing on the forest floor, with boots of polished leather that, even in the foggy weather, still shined. Following the coachman's body, the blacksmith saw that the coachman held two things in his gloved leather hands. In one hand, the coachman held a hatchet that was larger than an axe. The blade was covered in a scarlet liquid that dripped and smelled like a cooking steak. That smell was something that the blacksmith was familiar with when cleaning the swords of knights. When steel was being cleaned of blood, it bled into the water and it smelled like a cooking steak. This coachman had definitely killed someone with that hatchet, and their blood still coated the hatchet's head. But what was in his other hand terrified the blacksmith even more than the hemorrhaging hatchet. In the coachman's other hand was a segmented whip, larger than any whip the blacksmith had seen before. The popper of the whip resembled a sharpened human tailbone. The thong of the whip was made out of human vertebrae, far more than any single human ever had. The keeper connecting the vertebrae to the handle was made of human fingers, acting as a guard to the coachman's hand. The handle was made of a human femur, with the butt knot being made out of a human skull. The blacksmith continued to look up the coachman and saw something he missed earlier. In the center of the coachman's chest was a coat of arms, a red shield with a green snake inside of it. The blacksmith whispered to himself as he looked up to make eye contact with the coachman. But Bob found it quite impossible to make eye contact. The coachman had no head, only a red collar above his broad chest. This wasn't any normal coachman. This was indeed the Headless Horseman. In a panic, the blacksmith swung his hammer where the fearsome Fay stood, only to have his hammer pass through the fog and darkness. The Headless Horseman's haunting howling echoed through Hasdrubal's hollow. The blacksmith surveyed the woods, trying to figure out where the laughter was coming from. It was the only source of sound in the forest. The blacksmith quickly ran as fast as he could, carrying his heavy bag, his only weapon, and his lantern. The branches tore at the blacksmith as he tried to escape the death coach behind him. After he ran for what felt like forever, he finally found a hollowed-out trunk. He quietly crouched into the tree trunk and waited for the Headless Horseman to pass by. The laughter faded as the horseman got further and further away. The blacksmith let himself take a relieved breath when he heard a small giggle behind him. He slowly turned to hear where the giggling was coming from. He expected to see a child from that giggling, but what he saw instead only froze his breath in his lungs. On the top of the stump, he saw the head of a pale young woman. Her red hair was straight and braided, and it looked almost like a scarf. Her green eyes glittered like jewels while she giggled while looking at the blacksmith. But the most shocking part was the fact that she only had a head with no body attached to it. Bob could see where her neck used to be. Her skin and tissue were cut crudely, like it took many tries to get the knife through. He could even see the vertebrae dangling that led from where her torn neck was severed and broken. And yet somehow this woman's head could still giggle. "Give me your name, and I will make it stop," the woman said to him. The blacksmith was smart enough not to give his name to the horseman's head. Giving your name to the Fae was a recipe for disaster, and a Dullahan could do even worse with his name than most of the frightful fairies. Instead, the blacksmith turned away and began to quietly crawl, hoping to avoid getting the Headless Horseman's attention. "Do you think that'll work? We're gonna get you, and you are going to wish that you gave me your name instead." Now the head went from giggling to full-on cackling. The laughter echoed through the woods, and the blacksmith couldn't tell where the source was. All he had to guide him was the light of his lantern, which only grew weaker and weaker as the night continued. The blacksmith wandered lost until he made it to another familiar clearing, one with freshly turned over dirt. He recognized this clearing. It wasn't far from his cabin. He could run for it from here. He glanced around, and while he could hear distant laughing, it wasn't too close. He figured he could run for it, and he could make it. The blacksmith, full of exhaustion and fear, ran with everything he could, running for the cabin whose silhouette was just beyond this clearing. The blacksmith felt every muscle burn as he pushed himself with everything he had, safety just a few yards away. But then, as he reached for the door handle, mere inches away from his outstretched fingers, he felt something grab his leg and pull him down. His relief turned to confusion, which then turned to fear, as he realized he was on the ground with both his lantern and hammer thrown beyond his reach. His sack was torn apart and its contents spilled around him. In his sack was 4 collars with iron chains. They were too large for any cat or dog, but far too small for any horse or livestock. The chains were red and smelled of cooking steak. The blacksmith reached for the iron chains and collars, only to be jerked back by his leg that was caught on the ground. Twisting around, the blacksmith could see that his leg was bleeding and tangled in a familiar bony whip. The tailbone popper dug into his calves and felt like it dug deep enough to reach into his bone. The Headless Horseman, mounted on his horse, towered over even the cabin as he pulled the blacksmith closer. Whip in one hand and in his other hand, he lifted the woman's head by her hair, like it was a trophy, while she looked over the scene below, cackling from the blacksmith's struggles. I told you, it would have ended quickly if you gave me your name, but now I'm going to make sure it lasts. The horseman's head warned Bob the blacksmith. The Dullahan dismounted the horse and pulled the blacksmith even closer. Bob struggled with everything he could, but all he managed to do was get muddy and bloody. If he still had his hammer, he would have broken his own leg to try and escape. Whatever this fearsome, frightful fairy had planned for him, he knew he wasn't going to like it. Bob, now at the feet of the Dullahan, he feared the horseman would simply finish him off. Instead, the Dullahan balanced the severed head between his shoulders and yanked the whip so that the blacksmith dangled upside down as he went up and up. Now face to face with the Dullahan, Bob the blacksmith, upside down, and the Dullahan, right side up, drew its hemorrhaging hatchet, and it was clear to the blacksmith what the heroic Headless Horseman had planned. The blacksmith stayed stoic, even as Bob wanted to blubber and beg for his life. Instead, the blacksmith stayed still, stoic, glassy eyes meeting glittering green jewels that night. I hunt the wolves at night. Now you will never prey on anyone, ever again, the Dullahan's head said, as the Headless Horseman threw Bob the blacksmith into the air, his hatchet tearing through the night. The blacksmith's head fell separate from his body. Just before the sun rose, a carriage of dark leather and white bone brought frightened women home to the village. The driver was a very large woman with a long red braid wrapped around her neck, almost like a scarf. The women were pale, tired, scared, starved, and scarred. Their families were relieved to see them again. Many rumors and tales spread through the village that day. The villagers who feared the Dullahan said it was the fairy who scarred them and marked them for the rest of their days. A promise to return, and they feared to go near the women who returned. The villagers who knew the Dullahan told a very different story about how the women got their scars. Bob the blacksmith was missed for a while, but the one thing everyone agreed on was that the Headless Horseman was the one who killed him. And while stories of the Headless Horseman who hunts in the hollow grew in telling and popularity, the village gradually forgot about the stories of a wolf that lived in the woods, killing anyone who was out after dark. Some say it was because something hunted it down.